Dr. Phil had seen it all. 30 years of facing humanity's darkest moments, broken families, shattered trust, and secrets so heavy they bent the spine of entire generations. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, something happened that even he wasn't prepared for. In the middle of taping, with cameras rolling and a live studio audience watching, Dr. Phil did something he had never done before. He stopped everything. The grandfather sitting across from him, hands trembling, had just said 5 words that changed the entire trajectory of the show. 5 words that made the producers freeze, the audience gasp, and Dr. Phil himself stand up and signal to cut the cameras. What those 5 words were and what happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in the show's history. But before we get there, you need to understand how this family ended up in that chair. Because the truth, when it finally came out, wasn't just shocking, it was devastating. If you want to see how Dr. Phil handled the most difficult confession of his career, subscribe now, because what's coming next will change the way you see family secrets forever. It started 3 weeks earlier. A woman named Margaret had written to the Dr. Phil show with a plea that was impossible to ignore. Her family was falling apart, she said, and nobody knew why. Her adult son, David, refused to speak to his own father. Margaret's husband, 78-year-old Robert, was withdrawing into silence, barely eating, barely sleeping. The tension in the house was suffocating, and Margaret felt like she was watching her family disintegrate in slow motion, with no explanation. The producers reached out. After several phone calls and pre-interviewing, the picture became clearer, or at least they thought it did. David, now 42, had cut off all contact with his father 2 years ago. He wouldn't say why. Robert wouldn't talk about it either. Margaret was caught in the middle, desperately trying to hold together a family that was splitting at the seams. Dr. Phil agreed to bring them on. This was the kind of case he specialized in: broken communication, unresolved conflicts, families trapped in painful silence. He had mediated thousands of these situations. He knew the patterns, the deflections, the walls people built to protect themselves from truths they didn't want to face. But as the interview began, something felt different. Robert sat in the guest chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He was a tall man, but age had bent him forward, as if he was carrying something unbearably heavy on his shoulders. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, holding his hand, her face lined with worry. David refused to sit near them. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw clenched, barely able to look in his father's direction. Dr. Phil opened the way he always did, direct, no nonsense, getting straight to the heart of the issue. "David, you haven't spoken to your father in 2 years. Help me understand why." David's response was cold, clipped. "Because I can't look at him anymore." Can't or won't? Both. Dr. Phil turned to Robert. "What do you think happened?" The old man didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, his breathing shallow. Finally, he said, "I don't know how to fix it." "Do you know what broke it?" Silence. And that's when Dr. Phil leaned forward, his voice dropping to that tone everyone who's watched the show knows, the one that says, "I'm not letting you hide anymore. Robert, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did something happen between you and David that you've never told anyone about?" The audience was completely still. Margaret's grip on her husband's hand tightened. David looked away, his jaw working like he was trying not to speak, trying not to explode. Robert's hand started to shake. "Yes," one word, but it landed like a boulder in the middle of the room. Dr. Phil didn't move. He just waited because he knew, after decades of doing this, that the truth was coming. It was already in motion. You couldn't stop it now, even if you tried. "What happened, Robert?" The old man's voice cracked. "It wasn't just David." Margaret's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Robert looked up for the first time, and his eyes were filled with something worse than guilt. It was shame, so deep that it eaten away at him from the inside. It was his brother, too. The room tilted. Margaret let go of his hand like she'd been burned. David turned his back completely, his shoulders shaking. The audience didn't make a sound, but you could feel the collective intake of breath, the sudden shift in the air, as everyone realized this was no longer just a family dispute. This was a confession. Dr. Phil stood up. His face was unreadable, but his body language said everything. This had just become something else entirely. He turned to the camera operators and said two words that almost never happen on live television: stop tape. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The cameras cut. The red recording lights went dark. For a moment, the studio was frozen in a strange kind of limbo, half reality show, half something far more raw and real than anyone had signed up for. The producers in the control room were scrambling, unsure whether to keep recording, whether to intervene, whether this was even safe to air. But Dr. Phil wasn't thinking about any of that. He walked over to Robert, crouched down so they were eye level, and spoke in a voice low enough that only the people on the stage could hear. "Robert, I need you to tell me exactly what you're saying, because if this is what I think it is, we need to handle this very carefully." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "I hurt them." "How?" I hit them when they were kids, more than I should have, more than anyone should." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She stood up, backing away from him like he was a stranger. "Robert, what are you talking about?" David finally turned around, his face twisted in pain and rage. "He's talking about the fact that he beat us until we couldn't stand. Mom, he's talking about the fact that he broke Joey's arm when he was 7 and told everyone it was a bike accident. He's talking about the fact that I still have scars on my back from his belt." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret looked like she might collapse. The audience was dead silent, some people crying, others just staring in disbelief. Dr. Phil stood up and walked to the center of the stage. He didn't speak right away. He just let the weight of what had been said settle over everyone. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth breathe. Then he turned back to Robert. "Why are you telling us this now?" Robert's voice broke completely. "Because I'm dying." The room seemed to stop moving entirely. "I have maybe 6 months, and I can't leave this world without trying to make it right. I know I can't undo it. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I had to say it. I had to tell them I'm sorry." Margaret was sobbing now, her face in her hands. David stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The audience didn't know where to look. Dr. Phil walked over to a small table at the side of the stage. On it was a sealed white envelope. He picked it up and held it in front of Robert. "Before you came here today, I had my team do something. I had them contact a trauma therapist who specializes in family abuse. Inside this envelope is a letter. It's an offer, a real offer for help, for you, for David, for your other son if he wants it, and for Margaret."
Because what you just admitted isn't something you walk away from. It's something you face. He placed the envelope on Robert's lap. "You don't get to die with this unresolved. Not if I have anything to say about it. And David," he turned to David, who was staring at the envelope like it was a live grenade. "You don't have to forgive him, but you do have to decide whether you want to carry this anger for the rest of your life or whether you want to try to let it go. Not for him, for you." David didn't respond. He just looked at his father, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't look away. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He brought in a licensed trauma counselor who had been on standby, and he spent the next hour off the air, with no cameras rolling, facilitating a conversation that was never meant to be entertainment. It was meant to be healing. When the cameras came back on, the energy in the room had changed. Robert was still crying, but there was something different in his posture. Margaret was sitting next to him again, not holding his hand, but present. And David was sitting across from them, not close, but no longer turned away. Dr. Phil addressed the audience directly. "What you just saw is not something we planned. It's not something we scripted. It's real life in all its messiness and pain. And I want to be very clear about something. Abuse is never okay. It doesn't matter if it happens. The damage is real, and the survivors deserve support." He looked at David. "You are not responsible for fixing this. You are not required to forgive, but you do have options. And we're going to make sure you have access to every resource available." The audience began to applaud, not the usual enthusiastic clapping, but something quieter, more solemn. It felt less like approval and more like solidarity. But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming. David stood up. He walked over to where the white envelope sat on his father's lap. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and then looked at Dr. Phil. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive him, but I'm willing to try to understand. Not for him, for me." He opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. It detailed a family therapy program, trauma counseling, and a structured plan for accountability and healing. David read it silently, his expression unreadable. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'll do it." Margaret broke down completely, covering her face with both hands. Robert reached out toward his son, but didn't touch him. David didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. Dr. Phil stepped forward. "This is not the end. This is just the beginning. And it's going to be hard. But you've taken the first step, and that's more than most people ever do." He turned to the camera. "If you or someone you know is dealing with trauma from childhood abuse, please reach out. There are resources. There is help. You do not have to carry this alone." The show ended there. No dramatic music, no applause, just the quiet acknowledgement that something real had happened, something that couldn't be wrapped up neatly in an hour. 3 months later, Dr. Phil's team followed up with the family. Robert had begun intensive therapy, facing the consequences of his actions in a way he never had before. David was working with a trauma specialist, slowly unpacking decades of buried pain. Margaret was in counseling too, processing her own grief and guilt over not seeing what was happening under her own roof. They weren't healed. Healing doesn't work that way, but they were trying. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing of all. What many people don't know is what happened in the weeks immediately following that taping. Robert wrote letters, dozens of them, to both of his sons. Not excuses, not justifications, just acknowledgments of the pain he had caused. David didn't respond to most of them, but he kept every single one. He told his therapist that seeing his father's handwriting, shaky and aged, made the man seem less like a monster and more like a broken human being. That didn't erase the abuse, but it created a small opening, a crack in the wall that had been built over decades. Margaret struggled the most. She had spent 50 years married to a man she thought she knew, only to discover that the foundation of their life together was built on secrets and violence she had never seen. Her therapist worked with her on something she had never allowed herself to feel: anger. Not just at Robert, but at herself for not knowing, for not seeing the signs, for not protecting her children. It was a long, painful process, but necessary because healing can't begin until you stop pretending the wound doesn't exist. Robert's health declined faster than anyone expected. The cancer was aggressive. By the 5th month, he was in hospice care. David visited twice. The conversations were brief, stilted, heavy with everything that could never be undone. But David showed up. That mattered. On Robert's last day, David sat by his bedside and said the only thing that felt true. "I don't forgive you, but I'm letting go of the hate. Not for you, for me." Robert died with those words in his ears. It wasn't redemption, but it was closure. The white envelope, the one Dr. Phil handed to Robert that day, became a symbol not of forgiveness, but of possibility, of the choice to stop running from the truth and start facing it, no matter how painful that might be. Dr. Phil kept a copy of that letter in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that some moments aren't about ratings or viral clips or entertainment. They're about showing up when it matters most and refusing to let people stay trapped in their silence. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop the tape. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.